everybody
Yes.
to the ultimate section of Communist University 2025. And before we begin today's talk on health, social care, class, gender and atomization by Ian, I would like to introduce Tam to continue his reading from the Brechtian Communist Manifesto.
Yes, thank you, Anne.
I'm sorry, we seem to have a problem with audio.
Very, very quiet.
To increase the-
Megan, speak.
Oh, welcome everybody to the penultimate session of Commerce University. Is that better? So should I carry on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry to anybody watching in. There was a bit of a glitch with the technology. But before we begin today's talk, I'd like to ask Tam Dean Burn to read from the Brechtian translation of Communist Manifesto.
Thanks, Anne. This is my penultimate section. I'll finish it off with a happy ending before Jack's talk this afternoon. We were talking about Luddites last night. Well, such light come into this now. Single workers to begin with. Then workers of a single plant fought their bourgeois owner. They began by fighting the ways and not the whole system of bourgeois production of goods. They trashed foreign commodities and machines and burned factories down to rid themselves of this new, more profound enslavement, to get back to the feudal enslavement, to arrest, despairing and tired, the iron hand on the world clock, by themselves forged. Still scattered all over the country, the proletarians remain long disunited, divided by deadly competition for work, and the divided workers fight first the enemy of their enemy, absolute monarchs and landowners, guildsmen and clerics, for still the flag of progress flutters over the bourgeoisie, and it's able to incorporate all victories. But any victory strengthens also the class it needed for winning. The growing large industries concentrate proletarians into ever huger masses. Workers grow alike. Who may find a wave in the turbulent torrent? Past differences, industriousness or skill are cancelled working the machine. Wages are equalized too. They fluctuate and sink in crisis or totally cease whenever no work is to be had. All of this torments all at the same time. Coalitions of workers appear, seeking to protect their wages. Open collisions begin. Here and there, briefly, workers may win. More often they lose the local battle for which they united, but the union stuck and transcended localities. Trains and then phones connect places. All over the country, scattered skirmishes grow to struggles of classes. As a class, the workers now fight the political fight, and the class, oft sundered through competition among its needy members, always united anew through new fights fought in common. Reaches for the letter of bourgeois law and forces the employer to come a cropper here and there. It manages to pinch a fleeting little hour or so off the long working day. But it knows, and when it forgets, blows will bring it back. It has to seize hold of the law and finally break its letter. The rising class gains much from the old class's dissension and constant infighting. Still, the bourgeoisie has to fight aristocrats in army and civil service, then within itself as the deadly roller of progress rolls over some of it. And above all and always, it fights the bourgeoisie of the other countries. All these require fellow fighters from lower strata, so it drags the proletariat to political struggles as helper and arms its own enemy in the arena. The proletariat learned how to learn. painstakingly exploited at workbench, drill, and construction crane. It needed education and was forced into schools. Meager the knowledge it got, and mostly falsified, but knowledge still of the power of knowledge and awareness about their thirst for their own knowledge.
Okay, and now we move on to health and social care work, class, gender and atomization, a talk from Ian Spencer. Ian will present for approximately 50 minutes, and after which we will have the usual questions and discussion. You want to take it away there, Ian?
Good morning, comrades. I think the area of health will be one of the key battlegrounds in the coming years. And it's absolutely central to what we as communists stand for. We want a society where all distribution is to meet human need. I won't pretend for one moment that the National Health Service is some sort of island of socialism. It isn't. But nevertheless, the one thing that's abidingly popular about the National Health Service is distribution according to need. It's under threat, and there are a whole range of different struggles that are taking place. In terms of people who work in health and social care, the majority are women. And for that reason, class and gender intersect here, and it's very important that we take that into account. I'm also going to be looking at areas such as the professions and their future. There's a bit of there are many themes that have run through Communist University over the week. And one is, in a sense, this distinction to be drawn between sociological conceptions of class and a Marxist conception of class. Those of you who don't know me, my first degree was in sociology and political economy, and I regard sociology as the devil with horns. Sociology doesn't necessarily come into being as a kind of attempt to refute Marx, but most of its real existence has been concerned with trying to provide a refutation for Marxism. It is, in a sense, the kind of social theory corollary of Keynesian economics, in terms of it being tied to a reformist political project. And from that point of view, although I will be drawing upon empirical data, not much of it, but there is empirical data, we don't have to have any fear of the empirical data that sociology throws up. I'll also be drawing a little bit on the sociology of the professions, and I'll explain why. In terms of gender, let's just start from the simple proposition that on average, women in Britain earn about 80% of the salaries of men. This is notwithstanding the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act. Now, the typical sociological explanation for this is what we might call a horizontal and vertical segregation within the workforce. By vertical, the higher up the dung pile you go of the class system, the greater the proportion of men. By horizontal, I mean that women are concentrated in particular occupations. So if you think about it, hospitality, health and social care, teaching, and typically, for example, if it's in teaching, it'll be primary and secondary and so on. So you see a segregation within the workforce. The questions about why we can talk about, because I think that's an important theoretical question, and I think it's an important one that we consider in our discussions. I think, as I say, this will be a key battleground and in a number of important areas. We know that resident doctors, what used to be called junior doctors are currently back in dispute with management, with the government. I was reading last night on the Royal College of Nursing website, May they burn and rot in hell. I'll come back to that in a minute. A consultative ballot, as it were, of nurses is that they have rejected the 3.5% that they've been offered by the government. Whether that translates into a strike vote remains to be seen, but we'll see. Forgive me if there are any occupational therapists or physios in the room. Don't get me started on social workers. I tend to use nursing as an example. It's just because I know it best, having started life as a nurse. I trained in 1970, from 1979 onwards, in the olden days when you could have more than one qualification. So I trained as a mental health nurse and as a general nurse. And so I tend to focus. It's also a very large part of the overall health and social care workforce. So I tend to use it as an example, but I'll come on more to that later. So I've mentioned gender and why I think that this is going to be a crucial factor that we take into account when we look at these subjects. But also, let's also remember migration. The relative success of reform recently and the tendency on the part of Labour and Tory to try and out-reform reform in their hostility to migration will pose a very real threat to the health and social care workforce. I'm going to argue that Wes Streeting, among others, is heading in the general direction of moving the NHS towards a US-style system for all sorts of reasons. The two pictures you see before you, one is an obvious one, which is doctors on a picket line. The other one is Thatcher, developing resources and minimum data set for care homes adoption. Yeah, right. Okay. Let me explain. I had the dubious privilege of working as a research assistant on this project, and it really is a vile piece of work. What Thatcher is aiming to do is to develop a minimum data set. So a data set to which all care homes in the country can sign up to. Everybody will be using. See, if you go into care homes, and I've worked in them and all, if you go into care homes, some will use one type of computer system, some will use others. A few are still even using paper, you know, that kind of stuff. In the United States and Canada, I believe, and other countries, there is a requirement to sign up to a minimum data set using a particular type of software. And what you're then doing is you're standardizing the systems for care homes in order to then fully integrate them into a wider healthcare system. It's a situation today where, for example, if you fall and break your leg, you generally go into hospital, you get treated. Broadly speaking, you will come out and you'll have your physiotherapy. In some cases, people will actually be rehabilitated in care homes, and the NHS will pay for that. And the relationship between care homes and the NHS is becoming more fuzzy. And I think the intention is, in the United States and Canada, if you want to be eligible, for example, for funding from Medicare, Medicaid, you have to have signed up to the data set. And that's what Thatcher's about. It's about coming up with a common data set and a common set of IT principles where the care homes can be integrated into a system which will be more like in the United States. I believe that's the underlying thing behind Thatcher. It's funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and there are a number of universities taking part. I was at the Newcastle University, but there are a whole load of them. You can go on their website and check it all out. So these are just some of the things that are coming up. So we're looking at the potential for the increasing privatisation of the NHS, in particular, opening up the UK health market to United States healthcare companies, and that's already happening. One of the little places I used to work in was called Cambion Appletree. It was a small psychiatric hospital just outside Durham, and the Cambion bit was the American healthcare company that owned the hospital, and all the patients were NHS patients. So they were funded by the NHS, but some of that was obviously going into the pockets of the shareholders of Cambion. They subsequently sold out to another company, and they've gone off to move into secure children's services, which apparently is far more lucrative. So this is what we're facing. And the care home sector is going to be particularly difficult to organise and politicise and so on. But it is absolutely crucial for all sorts of reasons that we'll come on to. This is a completely gratuitous opportunity for me to show you a picture that I like. I do that kind of stuff. Tina will attest to my mild obsession with the works of William Hogarth. And what we see here is the fourth plate from his series on cruelty. It starts off, the bloke that's on the table currently being anatomized, as it would be called, has been hanged. As you can see, he's still, I didn't see the little cursor, there's a cursor there. He's still got the noose around his neck where he's been hanged. At this point, which is 1751, the only people who could be used at the surgeon's hall for anatomy and physiology examinations and so on were convicted felons. It's the first plate in the series. You see this gentleman torturing a poor little dog, and he goes on to kill the woman, well, I suppose his wife, loosely speaking. So the idea that you start off with any sort of cruelty eventually ends up, and he ends up, this is the reward for cruelty, and there's a little dog eating his heart. Gotcha. And in the back, there's two skeletons pointing at one another, presumably accusing one another of something or other. But what I really wanted to point out was, here are the surgeons, manual workers organised within a sort of guild system. By this time, I think they would probably stop cutting hair, but at one time they used to cut hair. So barber surgeons were organised in the guild system. These chaps with the mortarboards were the physicians. And as you see, they're all chatting away amongst themselves. They've no need to look at this empirical stuff of guts and what have you. And there's the professor giving the lecture up at the back there. So the reason why I've thrown that in utterly gratuitously to share my love of Hogarth is to illustrate the Medical Act of 1858. The opening lines of which are, whereas it is expedient that persons requiring medical aid should be enabled to distinguish qualified from unqualified practitioners. And in a sense, here is the beginnings of a professional monopoly. You have to be on the General Medical Council in order to be called a physician. At the time, of course, surgeons were not doctors, they were craftsmen. And so in British medicine, you get this peculiar thing that as soon as you become a licentiate of the Royal College of Royal College of Surgeons, you lose the doctor prefix and you become Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, weirdly. Anyway. What I'm suggesting is that there's been a process going on, and that professionalisation, in a sense, is a bit analogous to craft unionism, where you protect your privileges against incursions from other occupations that might be able to do the same kind of thing. Apothecaries, for example, pharmacists. So, and of course, what we're now seeing is an emphasis upon actually, don't bother the doctor because you've got a cold or something. Go and see your pharmacist, and if you've got this, if you've got cystitis, go and see your pharmacist. You don't need to bother the doctor. And actually, we're starting to see these professional boundaries starting to break down. And I'm arguing that there is a process of proletarianization going on in what previously had been regarded as the professions which had been seen to have a fairly unassailable monopoly in their particular occupations. That doesn't mean to say they're dead yet, and there's a lot to discuss about that, because after all, many of the professions have more than just a monopoly on calling themselves doctors or nurses or whatever. Some of them have a kind of an important kind of legal function, medico-legal function, and so on. So the idea that the professions are all going to disappear down the tubes in the next couple of years, it would be far-fetched. But nevertheless, this process is taking place, and I believe it's taking place for reasons of class struggle, and that class struggle is at the heart of professionalisation in certain cases, in particular with regard to nursing. This is my old alma mater. This is this asylum here. It was the Surrey County Asylum, built in it was 1907, I think it was finished. it's now a rather swish housing estate called Netherton on the Hill, but it was Netherton Hospital in Causden in Surrey, which is sort of on the Brighton Road as you head out of South London. Psychiatrists had started to organise themselves a little before the Medical Registration Act. So the Medico-Psychological Society, it was called something else before, something like the Association of Asylum Physicians and something else. But by 1856, it became the Medico-Psychological Society. And it not only regulated doctors working in asylums, but it also took on the regulation of people working in nursing in the asylums. It's not widely known, but there was actually a nationally recognised certificate in mental health nursing long before nurse registration. Well, a good 20 years before 30 years before nurse registration. The certificate of proficiency in nursing, they had produced a manual for attendance in asylums in 1885. So they provided the curriculum, they provided the training, asylum attendants were supposed to turn up to lectures and so on and that kind of thing. And it was more or less a 3-year apprenticeship in the asylums. In 1910, in part because of changes to, I think it was related to the old age, the old age pension, which was a kind of contributory pension system. Asylum attendants' pay at this time was roughly related to agricultural labour. If you ever get the opportunity to visit some old asylums, the ones that are still existing, quite often they had extensive agricultural land attached to them. Netherton Hospital was a more or less self-sufficient agricultural entity. It had extensive fields, it had an orchard, it had chicken sheds. The bloke who used to run the nurses' home at Netherton Hospital previously had been employed as the chicken farmer. And the chicken sheds were all still there when I was a student nurse, but unused. So asylum attendants typically worked long hours, so strikes in 1910 and 1918 were in support of a demand for a 48-hour week. And gradually, and particularly after the Second World War, the pay started to creep up, and in an interesting way. Asylum attendants actually got paid a bit better than general nurses in many ways. There was a thing called psychiatric lead, but more importantly, there were extensive estates attached to the old asylums. If anybody knows Wormwood Scrubs Prison or Durham Prison, there were a lot of houses around there that used to be prison officers' houses. And after the Second World War, the terms and conditions for asylum attendants was pretty much the same as prison officers. So there was a thing called mental health officer status, for example, where you could retire at 55 on a pretty good pension. More importantly, you got access to subsidised housing in the way that prison officers did and in the way that police officers did. And this was part of a whole range of concessions that were made in the period of militancy before the First World War and after it. The National Asylum Workers Union was founded in 1910. There was a brief strike in 1910 at Prestwich Asylum, and that led to the foundation of the Asylum Workers Union. Subsequently, it merged with the Hospital and Welfare Services Union to form the Confederation of Health Service Employees in 1946. I was a member of the other one, the National Union of Public Employees, which I joined because it was I saw it as a more general workers' union. I wanted to have a more solidarity, as it were, with the porters and the cleaners and whatever. So I joined that one. But they work very closely together. And in the asylums, the overwhelming majority of people were in a union, and they were in a TUC affiliated union. The only people who were in the Royal College of Nursing were frankly weird, or Tories, or people who had been general nurses before and were slumming it in psychiatry, as it were. And very few psychiatric nurses joined the Royal College of Nursing. Interestingly, the certificate of the Medico-Psychological Society was accepted as entry to the specialist register for mental health nurses, where they weren't called that mental nurses, when nurse registration came into being in 1919. The asylums, as you know, are now largely a thing of the past. Some of them are still up and running. St Nick's in Newcastle is still there. They kept the building, which is lovely. A lot of them were listed. This is Netherton, where I trained, is a listed building, and many parts of it were very beautiful. And also had extensive grounds for things like cricket and bowls. And this was all part of the whole life of the institution, but for the staff, not the patients, obviously. But mental health beds have declined every year since 1956. And Enoch Powell, who was Conservative Health Minister in 1961, which was a magnificent year, the successful defense of the Cuban Revolution in the Bay of Pigs, my birthday, and the publication of Irving Goffman's rubbishy little book called Asylums. So 1961, Water Tower speech, Enoch Powell is effectively announcing the intention to close down the asylums. And that process was taking place throughout the 60s and 70s and accelerated enormously after the defeat of the 1982 health workers dispute. Effectively, the defeat of the 1982 health workers dispute not only was a death knell for the asylums, and also, for that matter, the trade union base within the NHS. And moreover, it was a dress rehearsal for the miners' strike. All the legislation that was used to break the 1982 health, all the legislation that was used to break the miners' strike was originally tried out in the 1982 health workers dispute in terms of secondary ticketing and solidarity action. And that's sometimes overlooked. I remember looking at the cabinet minutes for the period of the 1982 health workers dispute, and I think it was Norman Fowler was health secretary, and he said in the cabinet minutes, he was actually minuted as saying, "Nobody has yet beaten the nurses." So there was an implicit understanding that in class struggle, nobody had yet beaten the nurses because of the widespread public support for nurses. And so they had a policy which was to basically buy off the nurses, and it succeeded. The Royal College of Nursing accepted a higher pay rise for qualified nurses and midwives and sold everybody else out down the river. And what that led to was the decimation, particularly of the asylums, and has had far-reaching consequences ever since. Enoch Powell in 1961 was talking in terms of mental health beds. He didn't use that term, but mental health beds might decline to as few as 75,000. Gives you an illustration. This is where I trained, for example, was about 1,000 beds, 42 wards, and none of them were locked. There's a thought, isn't it? None of them were locked. There were 4 wards that were lovingly known as the close supervision unit, where this is where you went if you smacked a charge nurse in the face. The close supervision unit, it was locked at night, but it wasn't locked during the day. And even people who were sectioned could wander the grounds usually. I didn't know anybody who was kept in. And in a sense, mental health has become more and more restrictive as time has gone on. And also, as the asylums have closed, the prisons have expanded. And that's not accidental. And there are currently only around 17,000, not 75 that Enoch Powell was talking about, 17,836 inpatient beds in the UK. And current bed occupancy is above 85%. So you have to be pretty sick to even get in the first place, and typically detained under the Mental Health Act. In fact, the levels of detention under the Mental Health Act are close. They're not quite as bad but approaching the kind of the 1890 Lunacy Act when everybody effectively was detained. So if we're talking about wages, and it will be largely an economic struggle in the health service, this is the kind of typical pay rates that you can imagine in the health service. And although this doesn't, for example, apply to care homes, inevitably, if a nurse is getting paid, a newly qualified nurse, for example, will start on band 5. So £31,049 up to 33,000. And is for each incremental point is 2 years. You have to wait 2 years before you get your next incremental point. A healthcare assistant will be down here on band 2 and sometimes band 3. There's quite a lot of struggle around here. I'll tell you why. When I was a student nurse, I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of nursing was done by either nurses or nurses in training. There were auxiliary nurses, and I was one of those as well before I started my training. But now, increasingly, the care is being done by healthcare workers, healthcare assistants. And they also do as much as what used to be done by the old state enrolled nurses. So they administer medicines, they will give injections, and much more besides. They'll do ECGs, they'll take blood, and so on and so forth. Things which used to be done not just by qualified nurses, but even by junior doctors. They weren't, I mean, so it was quite unusual to be able to take blood, for example. Even if you were a registered nurse, you would have had to have done another little course. But now, so support workers are doing the kinds of jobs that qualified nurses used to do. Now, if you know the pay, what I want to point out is the relationship to police constables' pay. So after probation, they're on a scale which goes from about 31,000 up to about 48,000. And in a sense, police constables' pay has always been something of an index of skilled manual labour. Up until the police strikes of 1918 and 1919, police constables were broadly speaking paid at the level of unskilled labour. After the police strikes of 1918 and 1919, their pay was increased to that of skilled manual workers. And it's largely been pegged there. It's easy to see why. 1918, 1919, Russian Revolution, the adoption of Clause 4 of the Labour Party's constitution in 1918. We might regard it as a load of Lassallean rubbish, but nevertheless, it was nevertheless enough, obviously, to frighten the living Jesus out of the noble lords when it came to looking at police officers' pay. So this is the skilled workers visa threshold. So when we're looking at people who want to come to Britain, God knows why would you come here? Why wouldn't you go to France or Spain or Portugal, somewhere nice? Good God. Anyway, nevertheless, if you do want to come here to work as a nurse, so the threshold for a skilled workers' pay is 41,700, but it's less for health workers. You can get in even if you're earning 25,000. So, and that will be the kind of pay rate that you'll get if you're working in a care home. And trust me, if you go into care homes, if you go into the NHS, if you removed all the migrant workers, it would collapse overnight, instantly. So the idea of actually restricting people to come in and work in care homes is just utterly fanciful. And it will produce tensions. And if Nigel Farage gets his way and actually becomes Prime Minister, he has been on record as saying we need to move to a more united healthcare system, more like the United States. So this is what we're looking at. So band 5 is a newly qualified nurse. Band 6 would be a fairly senior staff nurse, and the ward manager would be on a band 7. And then you get into the kind of lofty realms of band 8, where you get, for example, advanced nurse practitioners. These are the ones who can prescribe. They do many of the jobs that have previously been done by junior doctors. And so it just gives you a little idea of what's going on. Just coming back to this question of gender and the fact that women on average earn about 80% of what men earn, I would tend to argue that healthcare work like this is pitched at a level. Oh, sorry, how do I go back? There we go. It's pitched at a level which I call deliberately to irritate people, not bad pay for women's work. And the reason why I say that is if you look at where women are concentrated in the occupational structure, although health work isn't well paid, it's better paid than retail. It's better paid than hospitality, for example, that kind of stuff. So it's pitched less than skilled manual labour, but better than many of the other jobs that are done by women. And I think that's I wouldn't say it was a conscious policy, but I think it's fairly deliberate. And if you look at and if you compare, for example, qualified nurse, 3 years training, to a police officer after 2 years probation, broadly comparable, but the police officer still has the edge. Interestingly, as occupations have seen something of a relative decline, whether that's medical practitioners, doctors to you and me, or nurses or whatever else, as they've become more lowly paid, they've also become more feminized. There are now more female medical practitioners in Britain than men, slightly more, and certainly more women go into medicine than men. Police officers, interestingly, have seen some reduction in their terms and conditions. Another good reason why we should be fraternising at every opportunity. And also, police work has become somewhat feminised as it has become more lowly paid, even though they are still relatively better paid. And usually the terms and conditions are actually much more important than the actual pay. So what you're really looking at is a full career in the police, retire after 30 years to a really quite handsome lump sum and a decent pension. And it's often sold on that basis as well. Let's have a little. Oh, I didn't know that S had done that. I wouldn't have let that go out. Anyway, look, that's what we're talking about with our junior doctors. Again, look at this. This is skilled manual workers' wage, right? Foundation doctors. I need a raise stat before I flatline. Cut so deep that not even a surgeon can fix it. So foundation doctors and special registrars, including GPs, 36,000 to 70,000. So again, you know, 70,000 is not bad, but try living on it in London. Speciality registrars, 41,000 to 61,000. And now here's the one. Physician assistant. What we're seeing is a move towards other occupations that can fill in jobs, because actually it's getting quite hard to recruit people into certain medical specialisms, in particular general practice. And the overall demographic for general practitioners is it's an aging population. And a lot of them are coming up for retirement. How are you going to fill that gap? And it's a constant complaint throughout Britain about how difficult it is to get a GP appointment in the world post-COVID. And physician assistants are seeing as ways of helping to fill that in. But if you look at physician assistants, so now how do you become a physician assistant? This is a 2-year course on the back of typically a cognate degree. So let's imagine you're an experienced nurse. You've got your degree in nursing, maybe a master's in nursing. If you want to do another 2 years, you could potentially become a physician assistant. And again, you'll have wider prescribing powers and that kind of thing. You're also starting. I haven't met any yet, but even in anaesthetics, the idea that you could have a physician assistant working in anaesthetics, for example. So those are the kinds of pay rates that we're looking at. And the Labour government, when it first came in, kind of had some sort of settlement with foundation doctors, and they got a 20% pay rise. And for a brief period, that kind of settled things down for a bit. Whereas Streeting has been quite vociferous and open about the fact that somehow he's regarding the foundation doctors as being quite irresponsible, of taking industrial action again, because they simply haven't made up the huge losses that they've suffered in the period over the last 30, 40 years. There's been a steady decline in their pay, and they will fight. What's interesting is whether the consultants will fight. And the consultants, of course, they're all earning considerably more, but they recognise that they're next. And they recognise that if they don't support the foundation doctors, who is going to be in the next kind of, who are going to be the consultants of the future? So there's starting to be some sort of solidarity from consultants, and it has led to strike action relatively recently. But whether it will do in the forthcoming struggles remains to be seen. This is Lord Ampthill, former Viceroy of India, I think he was, looking resplendent in his Masonic regalia. So looking at the Nurse Registration Act of 1919, why would we do that? Well, here we are. It's another kind of version of professionalisation. It's another example of how you get a guaranteed monopoly on who calls themselves a nurse. And one which has been the basis of struggle. And I can't, but I do love the quote, really. Another reason of expediency. He was speaking at a time when there was another possible act that had been proposed, and he was speaking against that and in favour of this Nurse Registration Act, because the other act would have given the register for nurses directly to the College of Nursing Limited, as it was then, before it gained its royal charter. It was the College of Nursing Limited, the organisation that was led by Mrs. Bedford Fenwick in the struggle for professionalisation rather than the trade union route. And this dialectic, this struggle between the professionalisers, if you like, and the trade unionists is something that runs through the health service. It was particularly the case in the asylums, but also what's often overlooked is the poor law hospitals. The poor law hospitals were different from the voluntary hospitals. The poor law hospitals were paid for out of the rates and catered for the impoverished poor, the impoverished population. And charitable hospitals also catered for the poor. But anyway, getting back to Lord Ampthill, this dynamic between professionalisers and trade unionists was what was keeping this noble lord awake at night. He was a liberal unionist. Hours of fun. Another reason of expediency is that if your lordships accept this bill, if you delay registration, you will force nurses into trade unions. This is not an idle threat. It is what is already happening. You have seen it in the case of the Asylum Workers Association. And if you force nurses to form trade unions in order to secure that which they regard, and rightly regard, as a measure of justice and a right to them, you will simply throw them into the arms of the Labour Party. Is that a desirable thing to do at the present time? Of course, it's not going to frighten anybody today, but as I say, 1919, enough to frighten Jesus out of the noble lords. So it was understood that if you make this concession to professionalism, it was a way of buying off a section of nurses. You have to understand that nurses at the time, there was kind of two routes, as it were. You could be a lady pupil, a lady pupil, and you trained for a year and you paid for your training, typically in a voluntary hospital. In the Florence Nightingale kind of tradition, you paid for your training and then you became a sister straight away, right? You were in charge because you were probably middle class and therefore you were there to run the ward. Or you were a pauper nurse where you trained for 3 years, and typically in poor law infirmaries, trained for 3 years and then when you qualified, you were a staff nurse. It was as stark as that. And 1919 was important because there were voluntary aid detachments. There were lots of people who joined up the armed forces as volunteer nurses to care for the the thousands and thousands of wounded soldiers, quite apart from people suffering from God knows what diseases at that time. Let's just give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the sheer numbers of nurses alone. So I'm not, I say, apologies to any occupational therapists in the room. The picture is a nice one of, I was a staff nurse at Trafford General Hospital when I worked there, but it was called Park Hospital in Trafford. And it was day one of the National Health Service when Anara and Bevan posed for this little photo shoot with matron. So there are 853,707 nurses on the Nursing and Midwifery Council register. So it is a pretty substantial part of the workforce. That doesn't mean to say there are that many people working as nurses. There are people like myself who are, I'm a registered nurse, but I'm working in an FE college teaching health and social care to kids. And it breaks down as 788,000 nurses, 46,000 midwives, 12,000 nurse associates, something which, I mean, what there used to be was the state enrolled nurse, and this is what is now the reinvention of the state enrolled nurse, 2-year training, and they do pretty much exactly the same job. But there will be sort of medico-legal reasons why they won't be allowed to do certain things. And I can expect that to be more and more and challenged more and more, as indeed it already was being with the enrolled nurses. And people who are dual trained, a nurse midwife, I'm dual trained, but that's increasingly rare, and it's to be deprecated, really. It's unfortunate. And still, only 11% of nurses are male, and only 0.6% of midwives are male. But what's interesting is that 29% of NHS mental nurses are male. So in mental health nursing, there was always more men. And typically when I point that out, people used to say, well, is it because you needed to be quite strong to hold them down or something? You know, no, it wasn't. It was partly the question of gender. Firstly, the asylums were gender segregated. So there were male wards and there were female wards. Netherton Hospital, there was a male key and a female key. There was a male half of the hospital and a female half of the hospital. And they only came together occasionally, the patients, for sort of dinner dances and whatever in the Great Hall, little social events from time to time. So they were sexually segregated, and so female nurses cared for the female patients and male nurses cared for the male patients. But also this whole question about how the terms and conditions of asylum attendance approximated that of prison officers, including the right to housing. So although asylum attendants were paid very little, they got subsidised housing, and that made up a huge difference. Effectively, what you're looking at is the idea of the family wage. And so male workers were getting a family wage. It was assumed that their wage had to be enough to raise a family. And of course, this is a kind of recurring theme through the fact that women historically have been more badly paid than men. Just to give you an idea of care homes, another gratuitous opportunity to show you a picture I like, Old Man in Red by Rembrandt. So there are around 16,700 care homes in the UK. The asylums were effectively repositories for the care of the elderly, many of whom had organic mental disorders, typically the dementias. Not all, but they'd either people who had grown old in the asylum and simply moved to what would then become lovingly known as psychogeriatric wards, or they were people who had Alzheimer's disease and were simply housed in the asylum. The care, you know, when I tell people about, when I used to tell people, you know, I've seen sort of patients toileted in the day room, for example, you know, commode wheeled out, somebody lifted up, skirt up, knickers down, straight onto the commode in the day room with everybody sitting around, saves watching the telly. And you got that sort of level of care, but not everywhere. And actually, some areas of care were very good. But I won't dwell on that. What I wanted to get across really was that Kathleen Jones, who's a very good kind of empirical historian of mental health care, pointed out in a critique of Enoch Powell's Water Tower speech that typically closing the asylums wouldn't be cheaper. It couldn't be. What you've got is not decarceration, but recarceration. The asylum has been simply turned into 16,700 care homes, most of which are privately owned. So we're also paying the dividends to shareholders, as well as paying for the care themselves. The population of care homes is nearly 500,000. So we're looking at nearly, so over 400,000 people live in care homes. And typically you get a distinction between residential homes and nursing homes. Nursing homes, as you might expect, these are people who are typically quite sick. So let's imagine you've got somebody who's got an oxygen concentrator and they've got varicose ulcers and they've got type 2 diabetes. They will need a nurse all the time. And only some care homes are designated as nursing, around 30%. Designated as nursing. And that means they have to have a nurse on the premises all the time. Again, it's this medico-legal requirement rather than because somehow there's a difference. Because actually, if you're looking at the residential residents, there's often no difference whatsoever. You've still got people with Parkinson's disease, you've still got people who are memory impaired, you've still got people who've got varicose ulcers or whatever else. And the distinction has got much more to do with funding levels. One of the other dubious little jobs I've done in my time was as a continuing healthcare assessor, where you try to, because at a certain level, the NHS will pay for your care. Below those requirements, so if we go back to my person with the oxygen concentrator and the type 2 diabetes and so on, even if they're not paid for, there will be a funded nursing component. And that doesn't go to the patient or their relatives. It goes in the pockets of the care home. And if your estate is more than 14,500, you're expected to make a contribution to the care. If your estate is more than 23,500, you're responsible for their entire care. So here we are, of all the neurodegenerative disorders in the world, the dementias require you're robbed of your house and you're paying again when you've paid in all your life. So the care homes are a crucial kind of battleground, and they're ones in which very few people are unionised at all. There is a bit of a tendency on the part, I think the GMB have made some efforts of unionising healthcare support workers. Nurses, insofar as they're in a union at all, will probably be in the Royal College of Nursing. Generally speaking, the only reason for being in the Royal College of Nursing is it's not a bad little insurance policy. If you end up in front of the Nursing and Midwifery Council, you really want the RCN on your side in terms of representation. So about 50% of this 400,000 people are self-funding. They're paying their entire care. But let's put that into context. About 5 years ago, I was working in a care home that was at the bottom end of the scale, really. It was a nice care home, don't get me wrong, but it was cheap. And by cheap, I mean it was £800 a week. And £1,000 a week at the time would have been a sort of fair to middling sort of one. The sort of place where I was a care home deputy manager, that was about £1,000 a week. And as I used to like to point out, by the time I was working there, I was old enough to actually be in the care home, but I couldn't have afforded it. And we're looking at a care home workforce of around 750,000. Now, this is crying out for unionisation. This is crying out for organisation. And above all, it's crying out for communism. A society based entirely upon the meeting of human need. The idea that you get robbed of your house because your nan's got dementia or whatever is just frankly appalling. It will be a source of constant tension and a source of struggle, and that's something that I think should be at the very heart of any minimum programme, the abolition of all charges for the care of the elderly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like now to move to questions and discussions, and if people can raise their hands. And, okay, if I can just, anybody else? Okay. Did somebody?
Sorry,
And then Casper.
Yeah, just a technical point on the unions. You said kosher. I saw kosher in 1945. I think that sort of time. So the health workers were in there, but of course that was one that formed part of Unison, wasn't it? When Nalgo, NUPE, and kosher together joined together to make present day Unison, which is one of the top. The biggest, isn't it? One of the biggest. So they're there now, aren't they? Yeah, yeah. No, that was just a point. You said at one point near the beginning, you said, you know, NHS. Of course, I'm not calling it socialism, you know, but in a certain sense, it is, isn't it? You know, in a certain sense, I was thinking about that this is one of the gains of the working class within capitalism. So when we discuss transition, I know that you can talk about transition from revolution to communism, but we have argued that, you know, the transition actually occurs before as well, in the sense that the working class makes gains within capitalism. I mentioned earlier the 10-Hour Act in 1848, I think it was. 1848, and that Marx wrote about as against a political economy of the working class is being asserted gained, you know, against capitalism in that sense. So it's a result of struggle. Struggle goes on, and we gain and we change capitalism. So capitalism is not just bald capitalism; it's capitalism with the working class having transformed it already within capitalism. So in that, I think, from a propaganda point of view, we're putting across our politics. You know, I think so. Who made a case earlier in one of the meetings? Somebody was saying, you know, there you've got neutral things happen. You know, if I think it's Tam was talking about something like that, they portray normal discussion doesn't contain class. You know, if you start saying class or saying it's a working class gain, you know, I say, oh, that's politics, right? Well, that's what we want, isn't it? We want to put that politics into it. So when we're discussing the health service, and, you know, among other, but it's the best, you know, best example, isn't it? Very popular, of course, has to be defended, but it's got to be proclaimed that it's not a normal part of capitalism. It's a working class part of capitalism that we've gained. So we should call it socialism, I think. I know you have to say, well, it's not actually, it's not the in the transition period after a revolution, you know, but it's something we should claim in that sense, in some form, you know, find the right words for it.
Okay. Casper?
System, because we have a completely privatized healthcare industry. It's a little bit, there is some centralization, but it is completely private. And then there is an interesting trend, and I don't know the exact numbers on it, but I would say most nurses in the Netherlands are actually self-employed, where they will work for one single employer, but be self-employed. So they won't have a contract with their real employer, which is, that's a massive thing that's happening, which also is one of those things that makes it really hard for the nurses to actually also unionize, because they are also, I think, similarly very low paid. I think our healthcare system looks a bit different though, but so it's not a direct comparison. I think it's an interesting thing that could also maybe trickle over here when if the healthcare system gets privatized more than it already is, because the care homes it seems like it is privatized to me. So that I think would also be a challenge for the union action, where that would be maybe like an important thing to fight for, is not the self-employment, because it's very often sold as it's more freedom, you get more hours and you get to yeah, you get to work more and you get to actually decide when you work. But the it is quite the circumstances for the workers are quite bad. So that would be a thing that I would look out for, because I imagine they would want to do that as well. It's very, or maybe there already is. I don't know, but yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Ian, for very interesting and important talk. The NHS is gradually going the way of housing and education. And how it's going that way is a technique set up by the Tory strategists in the 1950s, and which was applied first to housing, which is to create less eligibility in the public system. And by creating less, making the public system worse, create attractiveness for privatization. Yeah. And there's no doubt about it. This is stuff. There's a guy who's written about this. It's a book called Clear Blue Water, the Conservative Party and the welfare state, and another book on the history of the Conservative Party. This is conscious planning, which is intended to take effect 30 or 40 years down the road, and to respond to it needs strategic responses which oppose that 30 or 40 years down the road. It's a second issue. I'm sort of curious about the history of the regulation issue. I think what's going on is imitating the solicitors, but the regulatory system before, in relation to doctors, there was a college of physicians, London College of Physicians, which had a monopoly right to license the practice of medicine. And there were battles over the question whether the possessors of Oxford and Cambridge medical degrees were entitled to practice without licensing from the College of Physicians. And Dr. Bonham's case in 1610, Groenevelt and Burwell in 1697 are already about this. So that the medical monopoly is already there. Yeah. And I suspect that when we come to the GMC, what we've got is the Act of 1858. What we've got is that it was the case that the regulation of lawyers was through the Inns of Court and the Inns of Chancery, which Inns of Court which dealt with barristers, the Inns of Chancery which dealt with attorneys, and they were directly regulated by the courts. Then, in order to get out from under the regulation of fees, the attorneys turned themselves into, quote, solicitors, because solicitors weren't governed by the legislation which fixed maximum fees. Solicitors originally meant, and still in the United States means, people who pester. So no solicitors, doorstep salesmen. Okay, so then the solicitors create voluntary, effectively trade unions to regulate, but then they fight for statutory recognition and statutory regulation. And it looks as though the success of the solicitors with making themselves respectable by statutory regulation pushes the doctors into statutory regulation rather than our old charter system with the College of Physicians and so on. So I'm sort of curious, that's sort of odd history. Another, the Warnford Hospital in Oxford, which is mental health hospital surviving in Oxford, has still got large gardens and estate attached to it. And they're sort of discussing the what to do with this stuff. Care, again, is another, just a pick. My daughter Alice is employed by Brighton Council for, among other things, assessing people's the legal obligation of the local council to provide care. and they're endlessly involved with, is it this council which is obliged to provide care, or is it some other council in London which is obliged to provide care and has dumped this person on Brighton? Is the relatives engage in scheming to get the title out of the name of the person who needs care, which in one sense you can't be, the whole system is so unsatisfactory. But the council's fighting over which council is obliged to provide care. It's go back to the old poor law. Yeah. Last, is unionisation. This is, you've made the point very strongly, this is very atomized workforce, very low levels of unionisation. Is unionisation going to be the way, or rather, is it going to be the way in which we think of unionisation is about unionising the shop and shop stewardism, and I wonder whether actually we're more in a situation where the workforce is sufficiently atomized that the unions need to think about building district organisation, that a lot of what they're doing is welfare work rather than strikes, but also equally the need for communism, the need for partyist organisation in order to create the level of contacts among people who are atomized at work to enable them to begin to be, they're going to get unions through the party, as happened in France and Germany, rather than parties through the unions, as happened in this country.
Yes, first, I have a question the common culture made on self-employed nurses. Because in the Netherlands, it's not the majority, but it's a minority, but it is significant. But I think that's pretty typical of the Dutch situation, because in the Netherlands, if you're self-employed, you get you mostly get higher pay because you pay less taxes and you pay no premiums for social security and your pension. But then you also, of course, don't get social security or pension. But they are on the brink of cracking down on that. It's actually one of the biggest issues in labor law right now, because they have like fake self-employment contracts because they do just the same job as like a regular nurse, but then they claim they are self-employed. And right now you can claim that you've had an employment contract all along. And then you can still have the right for the social security and pension, which is going to be a massive issue in the coming few years when everyone starts to realize that, but they'll probably do something about it in legislation, but who knows. But the comment I want to make was on gender, because I believe you said somewhere at the beginning that the wages started to fall and then it became more feminized. But I think most of the time it's more the other way around. Like first the women enter the workforce and they gravitate toward like a sector like nursing, and then the pay rates start to fall, and then it even gets more feminized because like the men don't want to do it anymore. Because it's also in the Netherlands, there's the occupation of primary teachers. There's this ranking, this research where people are asked to rank different occupation by prestige. And over the years, like a primary teacher used to have like quite a high prestige, but it fell. Like as it became more feminized, the prestige fell and also the wages fell. And I think that's, of course, like a dialectical relation. But I think it starts like with the women entering the workforce, and then they have like the excuse to lower the pay. Yeah, that's it.
Jim and Tina.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was an interesting history and in some memories. I think the NHS must be the most popular thing that the British government's ever introduced, I should think. The Tories are proud of it. I read recently that they voted against it 22 times when it was being established. And of course, it was established in 1948, 1951. Ernest Bevin resigned from the Labour government, along with Harold Wilson. Was that his first claim to fame? When charges were going on spectacles and prescriptions. So they've been starting to defund it right from the very beginning. And of course, one of the big ones was hospital trusts, so that hospitals didn't and of course, that was also the asylums. One of the big things about privatisation was to sell off the asylums because, as you said, they had a lot of land. They had grade 1 or grade 2 listed buildings, plenty of money there, gone, and replaced by care in the community, which I've always called myself lack of care in the community. As you see every day in the papers pretty well, somebody has stopped taking their medication and murdered their wife or their child or a passerby, and so on. And yet, still, my hearing aids are NHS hearing aids, and they work quite well, I think. I think they work quite well, whether anybody else does, of course. I've had that joke a few times. My wife and a friend got private hearing aids around this, well, a couple of years ago. They cost 3,000 odd quid. A couple of years ago, so presumably there's a good deal more now. But it was been in the papers, in the press for decades about the elderly population, the aging population, because of course the vaccines and so on, polio and all, antibiotics and all the rest of it, a lot of that came in around the time of the Second World War. And so you've had an aging population since then. People having fewer children because they didn't need 8 children to have 2 to look after them when they were old. So it's been known and ignored largely. You're saying about pay. I ended my career with a few years as a junior civil servant, and just about the time I was leaving, 2014, they were saying about freezing pay to certain rates over the next few years. I estimated that would be about, by the time this allegedly ended, that would be about an 18% loss of pay. And I spoke to friends not long ago, I meet them regularly, friends I used to work with, and they said, yeah, they reckon they lost about 20% of their pay. And now we also have in the papers, in the news, GPs can't get jobs. Loads of them. So, yes, as I said at the beginning, the most popular thing that any government's ever introduced, I think. And one of the things that the Communist Party, when we take power, is going to have to thoroughly renew.
Yeah, I just find it interesting coming to Britain as a foreigner and hearing about, you know, the socialistic NHS and how wonderful it is, etc. It's not, you know, compared to the health service in Germany, for example. It is pretty damn shit. It also is owned by the state. It's also you know, both are run for, you know, the need. You know, you go there if you need treatment and you get treated and you don't pay. You pay via your wages, etc. And that's, I think, a similar level. I don't know how you count it in Britain precisely. In Germany, you pay about 20% of your gross income. I think it's sort of similar, isn't it, in Britain? But in Germany, for example, there's the actual annual financial support for the NHS. German version is 500 billion. I think here it's about 180 billion or something. It's a huge discrepancy, and you can tell it in the quality, etc. It's much better in Germany. But, you know, in Germany, nobody would call it socialistic. Nobody would call it, you know, that's an example of the socialism that we need to, you know, preserve, etc. Because it isn't really, is it? It's not run by the workforce. It's not run by the doctors. It's a huge bureaucracy. Yes, it is better than what existed before, and you know, it is a sign of pressure of some sort, having forced it onto the state. But it's not, you know, if that is the sort of kind of planning that our socialism would look like, bloody hell. I mean, it's like Soviet Union type planning, isn't it? It's huge bureaucracy. I mean, I know what you're saying about this. You know, there's a danger in, you know, having this IT data, dacha, sounds like a Russian thing as well, doesn't it? Funnily enough, having that, you know, that it leads to privatizations. But why on earth isn't there one IT system in place? It's ridiculous. You know, this is like, it sounds like the worst kind of planning, everybody doing their own thing. I mean, and, you know, going to a British hospital is not a pleasant experience, is it? And then that sounds like a total nightmare. Everybody's, you know, everything's falling apart, isn't it? So, you know, yes, of course, I'm in favor of defending it, but, you know, I think we should be very clear that this is not even 2% of what we actually need. You know, defend the NHS, but fight for something much, much better. I mean, you know, then you have this illusion and this sort of misty-eyed approach to the NHS by, you know, the Corbynites, you know, that kind of Ken Loach, you know, 1945, how wonderful that was. We're almost there at socialism, etc. We just have to go back there and revive Keynesianism. Wouldn't that be lovely? And they've done it then. Why can't we do it now? Which is, of course, totally misunderstanding why Keynesianism was used by the ruling class. I think it was a reflection of the the Cold War. It was a reflection of the Soviet Union being a red threat, of course, for the same reasons the German system is so good, you know, that they after the disaster of Versailles, etc., after the Second World War, really, you know, a conscious decision was made to prop up Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, and they put a lot of money, the Americans, imperialist system, a lot of money, and, you know, propping up Germany and making it semi, you know, not socialistic either, but, you know, one of the best financed welfare systems, etc., etc. So, but to go back to that, you know, to argue that, well, if they did it then, we can do it now, misunderstands how the global situation has changed. There is no need for the capitalist class to give us those kind of crumbs at the moment. Obviously, if we get better organized, etc. But, you know, just to appeal to the state to do what they did then is just such a losing strategy, because there's no need for them to do it.
Hey, Jerry? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if people are familiar with the works of Dr. Bob Gill, who tells everybody how far down the line the privatization of the NHS has gone. It's gone a long way down the line. In the Morning Star, I read objections. Well, what is going to happen if Ireland becomes united, and how will you integrate the health service? Because the south of Ireland has a private healthcare, and in the north of Ireland, you have the principle still exists that it's free at the point of access. But in fact, if you look at the Gini coefficient for the south of Ireland,